All right, looks like we've got people starting to filter in. I've always wondered why Zoom lets people in on seemingly a one-by-one basis. I don't know why the software would require that, because I can see the number tick up like 1 or 2 participants at a time. If everyone can hear, see us, see the slide deck, people are already raising their hands, anticipating what I'm about to ask. Okay, so it sounds like people, yeah, people can see and hear us. That's great. So we're just at the top of the hour now, 12 Eastern, 9 Pacific, or Arizona time, as it may be.
Aaron's here.
We should have brought some this time.
Yeah, that'd be funny if the answer was ever yes.
Yeah. All right, so we'll give it another minute or two before diving in, just as people are continuing to join here. All right, well, I am Ryan Raffin. I'm a partner with Charitable Solutions, and joining me today is Russ Willis, a manager, also with Charitable Solutions. Past webinar participants will be used to Brian Klontz, our founder, doing the intro, and they'll know that he typically kind of explains everything and who's presenting, whether it's him or me or Russ or someone else or some combination thereof. But Brian is this week on a well-deserved vacation, so he's actually not joining at all. And the introductory comments fall to me, I suppose. As anyone who has tuned into this before knows, we do these webinars about once a month and have been for a couple of years now. I think we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary. If this may actually be the 2-year anniversary itself, which I hadn't considered until just this moment. As with past webinars, we are not going to be sharing slides. We do make the presentation itself available after the fact and freely available on our website, charitablesolutionsllc.com. So you can view the webinar later. We will not be distributing the slides. That link to the video will be shared with all registrants for the webinars, both today and Thursday. Along with that link, what we do is we collect all of the questions that came in during both presentations, include the answers, and send those along in a Word document. So those will be available for everyone as well. Even if you were only on one of the webinars, you'll be able to see some of the questions that were asked during the other webinar. And on that note, if there are any questions here, if you could drop those in the Q&A rather than the chat, that would be very helpful. It's a little easier for Russ and I to monitor them and make sure we're not missing them. And so we have a chance, if we can, to answer them live during the webinar itself. But in any case, if we don't get to it, it will be distributed and answered in an email following the webinars this week. So with that said, this month's discussion is about the rapidly rising 75/20 rates and how those alter gift planning incentives. Before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I'm going to go over a little bit of what Brian always calls propaganda for the firm. Since it's a free webinar, we try to include these comments every month. Charitable Solutions LLC is a planned giving risk management firm. And what does that mean? We are making charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. And how do we do that? In several different ways with several different subsidiary organizations. Describing each of these quickly, starting with the top right, the Emergency Assistance Foundation. that specializes in corporate-sponsored disaster relief and hardship relief funds, whereby large corporate orgs are putting together funds to help employees and sometimes their family members and even others in their community in need. So things like natural disasters, hurricanes, certainly during COVID, there was a lot of hardship relief measures. The Emergency Assistance Foundation has grown quite a bit over the years. I don't know that Brian ever emphasizes this, but I've seen it grow from an organization where one person could manage all of the relief applications now to, I think they have dozens of people managing those. There are over 300 corporate sponsors with millions of employees taking part. So that has been one model for facilitating charitable giving and making these gifts to people in need. Another thing we do a lot of, moving, I guess, clockwise, the professional advisor continuing education, aka this webinar series, what we're doing right now. Anyone who knows Brian will probably have seen him speak either through Zoom these last couple of years or in person. The in-person speaking engagements and continuing education is really starting to ramp up again. And really a lot of the rest of the Charitable Solutions firm has experience with that sort of webinar, presentation, symposium, whatever you want to call it. I've done a little bit of it. Russ has done a lot more. So you know, even some of the people on our team who are watching this webinar right now have experience and probably more experience than I do. I'm thinking of John in particular, who I know is watching. Charitable Appraisals LLC is one of our newer business lines. The goal there is to provide appraisals for really the full gamut of non-cash assets that we have lots of experience dealing with as gifts, but we also started doing more and more appraisals, particularly with cryptocurrency. And we decided to expand that about a year ago. Now we've got about 4 appraisers on staff on the team who can really appraise any type of asset. And the motto really is, if you can give it to charity, we can appraise it. And these are usually appraisals related to either outright charitable gifts or charitable remainder trusts, things of that nature. Charitable gift annuity risk management. This is really Brian's baby, and I won't have comments anywhere near what he can share on this. I don't do much with it at all. I know he's looking primarily at risk management and analysis for gift annuity pools, as well as dealing with some reinsurance. If you have more questions about that, I would encourage you to wait until Brian is back from vacation in the first week of August, and then reach out to him about it. The National Gift Annuity Foundation. This is the largest independent gift annuity platform in the country now. Over 600 contracts. We are active in all 50 states now, including Hawaii, which was the lone holdout for many years. So if you, as a representative of a charitable organization watching this, have a donor who lives in a more challenging state, like say New York, California, Washington, you have a gift annuity pool, you're not licensed in one of those states because they're a pain, you could refer them over to us, and we could issue the gift annuity in that state. Finally, non-cash asset risk management. For me at least, kind of my bread and butter, the way I spend most of my days, takes 2 forms generally. One is as a strictly consulting feature. Charitable Solutions can be retained by charities to help them accept non-cash asset donations of various stripes. We do a bit of that, but more of what we do is sort of an outsourced option through Decamai Foundation, whereby charities are referring donors with non-cash assets that they can't accept directly to us, that we will then accept into our donor advised fund, Decamai Foundation, which has a broad array of experience with assets of many different types. And that actually takes me kind of to the next slide, which is a bit of an overview on the activity with Decami last year. The point of emphasis is really at the top there. 100% of these gifts were declined by the referring charity. We are helping with Decami to make gifts happen that otherwise would not. And you can see here that we're not talking small numbers either. Over 260 donations in 2021. Like most donor advised funds, it was a very good year for us in 2021. Total value there, almost 1.2 billion. That works out to an average gift size of about 4.5 million. From year to year, regardless of the number of donations we get, that average does tend to stay pretty consistent, usually 3-4 million on average. And you can see that about 60% of the donations we got last year were business interests of one type or another, C Corp, S Corp, LLC. And the S Corp number is a little bit lower, but that's only because some of the things that are categorized in that count as LLCs are actually S Corp. So between C Corp, S Corp, LLC, it's probably about 50 of each, making up that little over 150 total. Real estate has always been a big part of the asset mix for donations that we receive. In most years, real estate is about half of our volume. Last year was a big year for cryptocurrency, as I'm sure many people tuning in know. We've done several webinars on the subject of cryptocurrency gifts, but you can see that even with 37 donations, 28 million, that's about 2% of our total gift value. So a lot of noise around cryptocurrency, but the value there is nowhere near as high as it is for business interests. That's really where the meat of the non-cash asset potential is in those business interests, and certainly in real estate as well. And the other kinds of odds and ends there, cash contributions usually for recommended investment opportunities from donors, and then the broad kind of other category, most of that taken up by foreign stock donations. So that's just an idea of what we're doing with Decami Foundation. So with that said, we'll jump into the presentation itself. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Russ to go through the agenda. And he's really going to handle the bulk of this presentation. I did want to draw everyone's attention to that important disclaimer. Please check with financial and tax advisors to verify any information we're about to share. These are free presentations, keep that in mind. And certainly as we, or maybe just me, as I try to contextualize some of the information in terms of broader market concerns, broader economic concerns, please realize that I have very little background in macroeconomics, and I don't think Russ does either. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Russ.
Thank you, Ryan, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, to our friends in the Eastern time zone. I'm Russ Willis, and I trust that many of you know me, and as Ryan says, we're beginning to return to an environment where you won't only see me on this screen, but maybe sometime at a conference or a luncheon. What we're going to talk about today relates to the fact that over the past several months, and especially if you reach back into 2020, the so-called Section 7520 rate has been climbing very fast. And we need to understand, since that rate is the rate that is used to place value on income versus remainder interests, and a lot of plan giving is in the form of split interest, we need to understand how that rising rate is going to affect tax incentives. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of reasons why people make the gifts that they do, but the value of the tax benefit is in the mix. So we're going to talk about first what exactly is the 7520 rate, What are some of, just in general terms, what are the effects of a rising rate, and therefore, what's going on when it's rising rapidly. I want to just make a brief aside about the fact that we also have a pending regulation out there that is going to, somewhat belatedly actually, revise the life expectancy tables. And the data now is going to be based on the 2010 census. Believe it or not, we've been using data from the 2000 census. So we're always at a 10-year lag regardless, but we're a couple of years beyond where the tables should have been changed. And because I guess we're not taking account of COVID yet, the tables do reflect pretty noticeable increases in life expectancies. And that will also have effects on the valuing of a life interest. We will talk specifically about a gift annuity situation, and we'll make note of the fact, and I'll make this more concrete when we get there, that yes, on the one hand, a rising rate has this effect on the value of the life interest, and therefore on the value of the deduction, but it has kind of the opposite effect on the taxability of the payout. So we'll take a look at that. In the meanwhile, incentives, there's been a burst of activity over the past few years when we had historically low 75/20 rates for short-term charitable lead annuity trusts in order to accelerate charitable deductions into the current year and so forth. As the 75/20 rate rises, those incentives are going to fade. The flip side of that is that the incentives for charitable remainder annuity trusts are going to improve. And we'll talk about the effect of the 75/20 rate on life estates. And then kind of shifting gears a little bit, we'll talk about sort of inverting the narrative and talk about the incentives as they affect accelerating existing split interest plans and commutations, surrendering the life interest in the gift annuity and so forth. We'll talk a little bit toward the end about pooled income funds, and among other things, we'll note that those are really not all that vulnerable on an ongoing basis to the 75/20 rate, and we'll talk about why. And then, as Ryan says, neither one of us is really an expert on market forces or the economy, but we will try to take a moment toward the end to reflect on some of the real world applications. It's one thing to talk about tax incentives. It's another thing to talk about what's going on in people's lives. So with that, I guess we can launch, Ryan. All right, so what actually even is the Section 75/20 rate? It is an assumption that the tax code requires us to make as to what is the current rate of return on an investment, so that we don't just invent that for ourselves. The tax code and the regulations under the tax code fix these stated rates so that when you make a gift and there's a value to be placed on an income interest and a remainder interest, there's no guesswork as to what the applicable rate is. It's dictated by the code and by the regs. It's a rate of return assumption for valuing income and remainder interest, and how it is set is it's 120% of the so-called midterm applicable federal rate. The applicable federal rate, or the midterm rate, is defined in another section of the code as the average of yields on midterm treasuries over the preceding month. Under the regulations, they choose the 14th of the month as the cutoff for when we run this average. And what they mean by midterm is treasuries that have a life of 3 years to 9 years. I think in reality, that's 3, 5, and 7. But that's what the midterm, they define it that way because we're also talking about loans and so forth. So what people sometimes forget is that this entire mechanism with Section 1274 and Section 75/20 didn't used to exist. Prior to 1989, when all this came into the tax code, the statutory rate was just a flat 10%. And that sounds astronomical today because we're going to be talking all day today about, having come out of almost zero and now being at 3.8 in August. 10% sounds astonishing, but when these sections of the code were enacted, The rate actually did float at about 10 and even slightly over 10% for a little while. It's been trending down since then, and we've had some historic lows along the way. And each time we hit one of these historic lows, people say, "Oh, look at the value of the charitable remainder annuity trust and so forth." But in 1998, that bump was at 5.4%. Then we went back up for a while. After 9/11, and actually we were already sort of trending into a recession even before that event, the rates trended down again to a point where we hit 3.0% in 2003. That was considered, historically low. After the catastrophe in 2007, 2008, we began to see numbers all the way down close to zero. And right now we're sort of in a recovery from that. In just at the beginning of this year, the 75/20 rate was still only 1.6%. And now in July, it's all the way up to 3.6%. It's 200 basis points just in the space of 6 or 7 months. And in August, just a few days, it's going to go up to 3.8%. That is fast. The last time we had a shift in rates that was that rapid was immediately following the financial collapse in 2007, 2008. And in that case, the shift was downward, strongly downward. So next slide.
Yeah, and as I switch over to that next slide, I did want to mention that this rate increase with the 75/20 rate in particular is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening as the rate environment overall. We're seeing really rapidly increasing rates kind of across the board, regardless of what you're looking at. And any regular reader of the Wall Street Journal or any other financial news will see that this is basically a daily news item now, and how the rates are increasing and how that's having an effect on market conditions. The Federal Reserve is really increasing benchmark rates aggressively to combat inflation, and inflation does kind of factor into a lot of donor calculations as they're thinking about these sorts of vehicles and these sorts of gifts and charitable giving more broadly. So keep in mind that this is part of a rising tide of rates overall, which has knock-on effects on the economy more broadly. Even things like mortgage rates are impacted by this. So that's just one thing I wanted to jump in on and before going back to Russ and letting him continue.
Sure. And along the same thought, an exception to these rising rates, they're rising in the short and midterm range, but relative to longer term rates, we're entering what they call an inversion, where the short-term rates are actually higher than the 30-year rate. What that implies, again, ask your local economist. But returning to the question to 75/20 rates and valuing income versus remainder interest, sometimes it's hard to remember, well, which way does this work? Okay, so I'm going to kind of take you through a little mnemonic here and begin by saying that whatever is the present value of the income interest and the present value of the remainder interest, those two things add to 100% of the value that you have in hand today. Okay, so if we assume that the rate of return on our investment is going to be higher, that will just in general benefit the income and the remainder interests proportionally to their relative value on day one. But if you have a fixed annuity, this becomes a little easier to see. If you have a fixed annuity, that's not going to improve as the rate of return on your investment improves. So if you're adding everything to 100%, the relative value of an annuity will fall as 75/20 rates rise. Okay. When you go onto one of these online calculators and you're asked to choose among the three rates that are available for charitable gifts at any given moment, they'll say, what's the best rate? When the best rate is going to tend to be the higher rate, even in the case of a unit trust. But what you want to keep in mind there is that, strictly speaking, that's not actually true. A unit trust is literally not affected by 75/20 rates if the payout were annual. The only reason that you will see a change in the value of an income interest in a unit trust as 75/20 rates fluctuate is that if you have more typically a quarterly payout, that income that is accruing to the trust in between the payments is going to enhance the principal value at the end of the year. And so that will slightly increase the unit trust payout in the following year. That's the manner in which a rising 75/20 rate affects the value of a unit trust. So let's get into some details, Ryan. Okay, so we should start with the example that is close to everyone's heart, because this is far and away the largest area in which people are making quote unquote planned charitable gifts is the gift annuity. And using data that ACGA has been putting out, I wanted to take the plain vanilla case, single life, age 79. That is sort of statistically, who it is that's making charitable gift annuities. And up until July 1st, the recommended rate was 6.2%. I'm going to use that for purposes of the discussion because I want to make a comparison to what's been happening over the past several months. But be aware that as of July 1st, the ACGA recommended rate for someone age 79 is now 6.8%. So that's going to assign additional value to the annuity, obviously. We're still not back at a place where they were as recently as 2018. Everybody was feeling optimistic, and they actually temporarily brought the recommended rate for somebody age 79 all the way up to 7.1%. We're not back there yet. Where do they get these rates? Well, they have their own set of assumptions as to what is going to be the internal rate of return that the charity is going to realize on the contributed assets in order to fund the gift annuity. And they are assuming that we're going to have a rate of return of about 4.5%. And then we're going to spend about 1% on a current basis, so sort of net 3.5. That is up, obviously, since they're increasing the rates now. The recommended rates are increasing. Until recently, they were assuming a 3.75% return, again with the 1% expense allocation. So what does that look like over just the past several months? If we are doing this in July and we're looking at the 75/20 rate of 3.6%, okay, the present value of an annuity for someone aged 79 paying 6.2% would be about 45% of the amount that they're putting into the contract, which means that the present value of the residuum to the charity, and therefore your deduction, would be a little over 55%. Well, you look back to January when the 75/20 rate was only 1.6%, the present value of the annuity was considerably higher. It was a little over 50%. So the present value of the residuum to the issuing charity was just under 50%. And so what this tells us is that the rising 75/20 rate is going to incentivize gift annuity, gifts to gift annuity arrangements, which is a good thing, right? And actually, the regulations that I mentioned a moment ago, maybe we should page to the next slide because I think that's where we talk about this.
Yeah, and there was a question about the date on that 6.8%
yes,
effective date.
July 1st.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're right. There's a typo there. I'm used to 2022. Yeah. Okay.
All
good
right.
catch.
So, yeah.
I wonder if we'll change that before Thursday. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, there's been a change. It's pending. It's not actually mandatory yet. So we're in this little soft space where you can choose the actuarial tables that have been in effect for the past 10, 12 years. Or the factors that are about to come into effect. Now, that could happen almost any day because there's no real rocket science. Well, there is rocket science. There's a lot of actuarial science to it and a lot of math. But the proposed regs were issued several months ago. They had a comment period that just closed a few days ago. The only comments they received were from software providers saying, all right, what's the rounding I'm at a loss for words here. What's the rounding protocol? 4 digits, 5 digits? And they're going to, work that out. But these will be finalized soon. And the moment they're finalized, the new tables become mandatory. So we're in a situation now where if a slightly shorter life expectancy works for the benefit of the for the tax calculation, you can still use the existing tables. But the moment these become mandatory, you won't have that opportunity. And actually, literally, you could use the new tables now, even though they're not mandatory yet. And the proposed regs allow you to use them all the way back to January of last year. Now, of course, for charitable split interests, you will have had to have a qualified appraisal. And if you've already filed your return, you had to have that appraisal in hand by the time you filed the return. So the only people who actually benefit from this opportunity to look back to January of last year are people whose returns are still on extension. So if you know somebody like that, you may want to revisit the qualified appraisal and consider whether you want to use the new life tables. But this will have an effect, and it'll go in the opposite direction of the rising 75/20 rates, because it's going to add value to the life income interest. And so the present value of the annuity would increase, and the present value of the residuum to the issuing charity will drop. So, if you have a pending case, possibly the time to close is right now before the new tables become mandatory. So let's move along. Okay. But we don't want to be myopic about charitable gift annuities. Sometimes people focus on, well, what's the value of the deduction, the residuum to the issuing charity? If it's higher, I get a better deduction. That's true, but there's a trade-off. Okay. If we're looking at a 75/20 rate of 3.6%, we'll just do that same comparison with January again. 27.2 cents of every dollar is going to be treated as ordinary income. But if we used the 1.6 rate from all the way back, and of course you can't, your 2-month look back for a deal that's closing in July is back to the May rate, which is 3.0%. But I use these extremes for illustration. If we were using a much lower 75/20 rate, a great deal less of every dollar of the annuity payout will be treated as ordinary income, and much more of it will be allocated to the return of investment. So, to make that short, while the higher 75/20 rate does yield a higher deduction, it also allocates more of the payout to ordinary income. So something that is not always front of mind when people are making these calculations. Ryan.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to a question that was just asked. Does the shift in the 75/20 rate in the concrete example you shared a couple slides ago mean that CGAs are more appealing to donors generally? And if so, is it because their tax deduction improves, or because their payment goes up, or something else? And I have some comments about this, but I think you can answer that too.
Well, I think it's widely practiced that people use the ACGA recommended maximum rates as the literal maximum. I think you'll find very few more adventurous charities who are offering gift annuity rates that are higher than the ACGA recommended rate. And then on the other side, I guess you will find, Ryan actually may be more familiar with this data than I am. I think you will find relatively few human beings who are buying a gift annuity who will say, oh, I'm happy to accept a lower payout. Okay, so it's not generally going to affect the rate of the annuity payout. What it will affect is the present value of the residuum to charity. The higher 75/20 rate is going to give you a higher deduction for the gift component of the annuity contract, but it will also mean that a larger portion of your current payout is going to be treated as ordinary income.
Yeah, and keeping that in mind, I think here is where we would probably want to be mindful of inflation, because it has always been my understanding, and all the reading I've ever done on gift annuities, and certainly CRATs versus CRUTs, that annuity streams are more sensitive to inflation, and indeed we are in a high inflation environment. I think that's probably particularly true for smaller charitable gift annuities, where those payouts start to look less and less material to the donors. With that said, a charitable gift annuity, should the Feds continue its efforts to tamp down inflation, it is possible for that reason and others that we will soon find ourselves in a recession. And in a recession, that gift annuity stream starts to look pretty good. So there are other factors here, but like Russ said, the 75/20 rate is certainly making the gift annuity look good in terms of the present deduction, even if that's happening with a background where inflation maybe makes the gift annuities look less valuable.
No.
Yeah,
and I don't know that we're going to get into, we do have a slide later on about accelerations. I guess you could, looking back on when you made the contract, if you're recovering your investment at a slower rate, then you still have more of your unrecovered investment available to use as a deduction if you make an acceleration down the road. But I doubt that most people are making that calculation on the way in the door. So again, sticking with the theme of fixed annuities for a short while, we did have this window of time where people were promoting charitable lead annuity trusts, and there are still plenty of reasons to do that. So I want to take sort of, again, the plain vanilla case, a 10% payout over 10 years. Usually you have one or the other or both of two things going on here. You're trying to accelerate the income tax deduction into the current year. That would be a grantor charitable lead trust. And or you're trying to leverage the gift tax value of the remainder out to non-charitable beneficiaries. But, again, a typical case might be a 10% payout over 10 years. Again, I'm really just trying to illustrate the force of these fluctuating 75/20 rates here. If we're looking at a 3.6% rate, and again, this time I really am only going to look at a 2-month look back to May when it was 3.0. The present value of the deductible annuity, the annuity is going out to charity on a current basis, is 82, almost 83%. And the present value of the residuum, either the reversion back to the grantor or the gift over to the non-charitable beneficiaries, is all the way down to 17.25%. But you look back 2 months, and the fact that the rising rate assigns less value to the annuity means that, well, I got that backwards, didn't I? That the present value of the deductible annuity was 85.3%, and the rising rate assigns less value to the annuity. Exactly. The deduction for the present value of the annuity stream out to the charity was higher by several points. And the present value of the residuum or the remainder out to the non-charitable beneficiaries was noticeably lower. And now, over the next few days, we're going to go into a 3.8% rate, and your look back is only going to be to June, where the rate was already 3.6%. So, the differences here are going to become a little bit more marginal. But who knows what's going to happen over coming months? We've had an incredible rise as recently as October of 2020. I think the rate was literally 0.4%. So, things are really happening here. I was about to hit the advance button, but I know that that's actually in Ryan's hands. Okay, so that's on the lead trust side. So correspondingly on the remainder trust side, and again, the typical case would be, the minimum payout over a term of years. We'll talk briefly about lifetime CRATs in a moment, but that's considerably less common. But if we had a 5% CRAT over 20 years, if we have the rate where it is right now, the present value of the annuity stream back to me is like 70%, and that my deductible remainder is just under 30%. And that's an improvement over where we were with the 2-month look back, where the annuity was 74 something percent, and the present value of the remainder was 25%. So that actually the incentives for CRATs are improving slightly. The reason I was talking about a 20-year term is because, obviously there's the possibility of setting up a CRAT for life. We used to have a problem with something called the probability of exhaustion. And in a way, we kind of still do. This was a rule that IRS created. It's not in the statute. It's not even in the formal regulations. But they made a calculation that if you set up an annuity trust for life, and the tables say that, well, the tables say you might live to be 110, okay? So the question is, of your cohort at the age of 70 or whatever, how many of those cohort are still going to be alive at various dates? And when you hit the point where only 5% of them are alive, that is the point at which IRS says, okay, well, the fact that the annuity might exhaust the trust in that interval becomes negligible, and they won't worry about it. But if more than 5% of your cohort are still alive at your life, at the moment at which the annuity would exhaust the trust, using today's 75-20 assumptions, then they'll say it doesn't even qualify as a charitable remainder annuity trust. That used to create a real problem as the 75-20 rates were tanking after 2007, 2008. The age at which you could set up a charitable remainder annuity trust kept climbing up. We got to like age 79. You couldn't set up a qualifying CRAT because you have to have a 5% payout minimum, unless you set it up for a term of years, which is why I gave that as the example in the previous slide. Or some creative people already figured this out, and IRS finally blessed it in 2016. They say, well, if you put a provision in the trust that says, if we reach that point and there's less than 10% of the initial contribution still sitting in the trust, then the trust will terminate early in favor of the charity. If you have that feature in the trust, they will allow you to go ahead and set it up for life. But a little footnote there, the value of your remainder is actually going to still be calculated with reference to the shorter of your life expectancy or the period over which the trust would exhaust. So you're not going to improve your deduction by using the life table if your term is already corresponding with where the trust would exhaust. So I said brief aside, and that was more than brief. Let's go ahead. Okay, so another fairly common vehicle for plan giving is a retained life estate. And if I wanted to give you an illustration here of exactly how the 75-20 rates are going to affect those values, in theory, I would show the depreciation on the house, and that just complicates things. So I'm going to assume raw land, because you could do a retained life estate on farmland. And we're going to erase the barns and silos for purposes of the example. So disregarding the depreciation, a higher rate of return does favor the income interest. Okay, so, simple comparison, 5% annuity that we just talked about, the remainder after a life estate is 62.5%, is 48%. As this is the comparison here, side by side. The remainder after a life estate is 62.6% at 3.6%, whereas a couple of months ago, with a somewhat lower 75-20 rate, it was considerably higher. And of course, as you can see, these actually work in opposite directions for the reason that an annuity, doesn't receive the benefit of the higher rate. So that's the best we can do with side by side. But the takeaway being that a rising 75-20 rate does chip away at the value of the remainder, which is, what people are looking at. What's the deduction? The remainder after a life estate does go down as the 75-20 rate goes up. There, I've said it in simple English.
Yeah, and if I could jump in just to discuss how this would play out practically, at least with the retained life estate donations that I've worked on. I think of all the gift structures that we're going to discuss in today's webinar, probably the retained life estate donors are least sensitive to the changes in the 75-20 rate, even if it means that their deduction is going to be reduced. And I think the reason for that is so often with an RLE, the alternative is a testamentary gift of the real estate. And for these donors, the deduction is often treated as something of a bonus. And so they're really thinking that any kind of deduction they get in the current year is just the cherry on top for doing a donation that they were going to do anyways. They wanted this property to move to their preferred charity after their lifetime, and that's still going to happen. They're just getting a deduction now. And if the 75/20 rate has changed such that that deduction is not quite as good as it might otherwise have been, that's probably less relevant to them. So yeah, I guess that would be my comment here when it comes to the retained life estate. So I'll get out of Russ's way as we flip to the next slide.
Yeah, well, we have a little time here. I'm seeing a question come in about PIFs, and we will try to get to that in a moment. But I want to, and I'll let Ryan study that question while we're talking about other things, because I'm not positive that I'm ready for the CPI kicker. But we'll get to that in a moment. So I did want to mention briefly that some of the incentives that we've been talking about, setting up these gifts, obviously work in somewhat the opposite direction. If you're talking about accelerating a gift annuity to the issuing charity, accelerating a charitable remainder trust to the remainder charity, even a commutation and replacing a charitable remainder trust with a gift annuity, that kind of thing. The higher 75/20 rates are going to reduce the tax incentive for assigning gift annuity to the issuer for the same reason that they are enhancing the incentive for setting one up. And that is that more value is being attributed to the residuum and less to the annuity. So as the 75/20 rate rises, the present value of my annuity stream, which is what it is, but as a present value proposition, it's going down, because I'm not benefiting from, whatever the market assumptions are behind the rising 75/20 rate. But on the flip side, now that we have these longer life expectancy tables coming in, that's going to actually add value to the annuity. So, accelerations of gift annuities, sort of a mixed bag right now where we are. And I had mentioned briefly when we were talking about gift annuities that there is a school of thought. I happen to be a subscriber to this school of thought, but I'm not going to make it a religion that other people have to follow, that if you are accelerating a gift annuity to the issuing charity, that your deduction may be or is limited by the amount of your unrecovered investment in the contract. So the earlier the better as far as making an acceleration, because as the annuity is paid out, a portion of that payout is you recovering your investment in the contract. So that goes down and the available deduction goes down. So similar thinking, if you have a charitable remainder unit trust and you want to make a commutation of that, again, fluctuating 75/20 rates don't really affect the value of a unit trust that much, except, of course, with respect to the quarterly payout or the more frequent than annual. But if you look at a commutation and moving the net proceeds into a gift annuity, you may have a slightly higher value in the life interest as the 75/20 rates rise. And you'll have a somewhat larger deduction for the gift annuity, because again, the 75/20 rate is assigning more value to the residuum to the charity. So, and the really fun thing is we're in this little window of time where we could use the existing actuarial tables or the new proposed actuarial tables that have not been made mandatory yet. And because this is technically two separate transactions, a commutation of the CRT over here and a contribution of the proceeds to the CGA over there, if it is in fact two different transactions, you might do something like the folks over at Sterling do, where you literally contribute the life interest and then it's sold as a proposition from within the CGA. But if you're staging this as two different transactions, you're not literally required to use the same life tables for both ends of the transaction. So there's, an opportunity there. And I think, okay, so pooled income funds on a daily basis are not actually affected directly by fluctuating 75/20 rates. Why? because the present value of the income interest and remainder interests in a pooled income fund are actually calculated with reference to 75/20 rates, yes, but not, immediately. A new pooled income fund that does not have a history of returns on investment does have to look at the 75/20 rates for the preceding 2 years and the year in which they're creating the fund, and use the highest of the average values there. So if we're looking at a new fund, literally the tables tell you that your assumed rate of return on a new pooled income fund is 1.6%. Last year it was 2.2%. This sort of shows we have this sort of lagging indicator of these falling rates. And literally, if we didn't have this turnaround this year, and we came up with an average 75/20 rate this year that was also close to zero, like it was last year, the assumed rate of return on a new fund next year would literally be zero. But that's not happening because we do have this rebound going on. So, and in fact, the rebound is so steep that it's already unlikely that we're going to hold on to the 1.6. We'll probably be back at 2.2 or maybe even a higher rate for new funds. How you value the income and remainder interests in an existing fund that has been around for at least 3 years is to literally look at the rate of return in the fund, the actual experience. I'm working on an appraisal right now for an acceleration or a surrender of an interest in a pooled income fund where they do have a history, and the rate of return, the relevant rate of return is well north of 7%. Again, the higher rate, the higher the assumed rate of return, the more value is assigned to the income interest. So this is a great moment, actually, for surrendering income interests in pooled income funds because, if, again, we're not pretending to be economists or market specialists here, if what we're entering into now is going to result in lower returns this year, then your running 3-year average is going to fall. And the present value of an income interest in a pooled fund will be lower next year than it is now. So, and the window, the opportunity for setting up a new fund that has an assumed rate of return of only 1.6%, that's closing. We will have a higher rate next year. Don't know what it is yet, but it'll be higher.
Yeah, and maybe this is the place where we should answer the question about pooled income funds. It would seem, I think, actually to be the natural place, not only because that's what we're discussing, Russ just finished discussing on this slide, but also because the next slide goes again to more of a discussion of broader market conditions and inflation. So the question we got was, in terms of inflation, are PIFs with the CPI kicker more attractive during the inflation challenge because the individual can be younger than most CGA philanthropic partners? And so Russ and I think, might have to kind of tag team here. My impulse and gut instinct perhaps is yes. I think I'm not super familiar with PIFs as a vehicle in practice. I didn't know that they could have some sort of inflation and adjustment, which presumably is what the CPI kicker refers to. I assume that's consumer price index. If they are able to take that into account in a high inflation environment, I would think that would be much more attractive, and particularly in comparison to CGAs, because CGAs do have that age limitation, and for some CGA issuers, they tend to be rather conservative when it comes to the age limitation, which cuts even more in favor of the PIF if it can be responsive to both inflationary concerns and have a broader pool of potential donors taking part. I would think that that's a great point, if I'm understanding the question correctly, and I think I am.
We could bring Michael on to give us the nuts and bolts on CPI kickers, but I can't do better than that answer. I do think, however, it's very useful for Michael to have noted the fact that the planned giving arena is much more open to younger donors or income beneficiaries, I guess is maybe the better way to look at it. with pooled funds. I think pooled funds are actually an underutilized vehicle, and we have this unique moment where we have extraordinary low assumed rates of return to get people in the door. And you know, because your real experience is going to be much better. But it is true that that the remainder values work out for a much broader age range of prospective beneficiaries with the pooled fund than they ever can with an annuity, a gift annuity. So it's a much better, it's a much more broadly available vehicle. So, all right.
Let's see. Yeah, and so final slide here. Just a broader charitable outlook. How does this play into 2022 for charities in general? As mentioned, the 75/20 rate does not increase in a vacuum. Not only are rates increasing across the board, we are seeing economic effects which reach the charitable sector as well. Because of the high inflation environment, donors may be less willing to contribute cash. And let's not put the cart ahead of the horse here. You know, the rising rates don't necessarily lead to inflation so much as the rising rates are intended to curb inflation. So while we're talking about rising rates, in a large part, that's in response to inflation across the economy, but that inflation does make cash donations maybe a little less appealing for the average donor. On the non-cash side of things, which is where I spend my day and can tell you from experience, real estate donations are looking probably not as good as they have over the last couple of years because rates have had a cooling effect on the real estate market, particularly the residential real estate market. Most people watching this probably know that residential real estate has been very hot across the country in all markets seemingly for the last couple of years. That's cooling off very, very quickly, even in previous, what I'd like to think of as kind of surefire real estate markets, places like the Bay Area. We are seeing properties sit on the market for longer. Buyers are less willing to snap up properties regardless of price. Fewer bidding wars. So if you as a charity are thinking about donations of real estate, particularly residential real estate, you might want to be cognizant of the cooling market, realize that it might take a little bit longer to sell, the price might not be quite as good as it would have been a year or two ago. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Additionally, on the private stock donation side of things, the rising rates here are impacting the capital markets, which really impacts the outlook for liquidity for you as the charity. Most charities take private stock donations, and the ones that do are usually looking to get to liquidity as soon as they can. Oftentimes that is done when there is some sort of broader acquisition of the entire business for which you as the charity receive some portion of stock. However, because capital markets are getting a bit tighter, because money is, loans are getting more expensive, that means that, again, as with real estate, these donations are maybe not quite as appealing. It might take a little bit longer for you as the charity to get out of these private stock donations. On the other hand, and this just occurred to me a moment ago, you may also see some donors with private stock approaching you and looking to move very, very quickly, trying to, in their eyes, perhaps get out while the getting is good, and get the have the stock be acquired by whoever the acquiring company is before interest rates rise even more than they have. So more broadly, I would say non-cash assets probably are going to be negatively impacted by these rising rates. as outright donations, at least in terms of the length of hold and perhaps the care and feeding they take to manage while you as the charity are holding these assets. With that said, as Russ said at the very beginning of the presentation, these interest rates are higher, but they are nowhere near as high as they have been at times historically. They're high really only in comparison to the last few years, which were very, very low. So that I think does it for the presentation. Were there any questions that we needed to address that have come in?
Yeah, I'm hearing that
Yeah.
the chat function is not, and actually when I try to use it, it only talks to you and me, but maybe that's a problem we can solve next time.
Yeah, apologies if the chat function was disabled. I don't know why that's the case.
Given the possibility cash donations may be impacted and the cooling of real estate as well as donations of securities, what would your recommendations be for talking with donors?
Yeah, I think planning has to maybe be a little more careful, and I think you have to look a little more carefully at donors' individual household balance sheets and see what assets they have now that are best suited for charitable giving. If your charity is willing to take real estate to begin with, you obviously have a higher risk tolerance. And so real estate is still strong, and it is still a stronger market. It's just tending to take a little bit longer. And so your charity might want to think a little more carefully about real estate that is management heavy, that is going to require out-of-pocket expenses to maintain. Those sorts of items can really backfire on you if you're stuck with something that has very high property taxes, utility and insurance that is likely to be very expensive, say commercial real estate. If there's not likely to be a quick sale, then maybe you as a charity want to stay away from that. And that's something that I think should be incorporated into a conversation with donors, saying, this is an asset that we could consider, but there needs to be some reassurance that it's not going to be something that you as the charity are stuck with. That's bad in the best of times, but it seems more likely now. Similarly, this is, I think, in large part what Russ was getting at. Maybe outright donations are, perhaps a little less appealing versus charitable gift annuities. That for donors who aren't as inflation sensitive, if what they're looking for is a deduction, then the charitable gift annuity maybe looks a little bit better compared to an outright gift, especially if it can be funded with cash, or marketable securities, something very liquid. So you as the charity are not funding the CGA with an illiquid asset, which is always risky.
I think that brings us to time.
All right. Okay. So I think, yeah, we are all done for the week. So here on this slide is a list of past free webinars. I wanted to thank everyone for joining Russ and I, and appreciate Russ's expertise on this issue. We'll be back next month with another webinar. I don't know what the topic is. I know we're always looking. So if anyone has any ideas of things they'd like to see us speak about, please feel free to get in touch. As mentioned, the webinar recording will be available either today's or Thursdays. And we'll send out that link via email sometime next week, along with answers to the questions from today and from Thursday. So thank you all for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.